Hello, everybody. Hello. So I'm Lucy Muirhead. I'm the host of today's webinar, and I have with me Tom Garside, who I will introduce in a moment. But first of all, some housekeeping. If you want to write a message in the chat box, just check that you've selected that the message will go to everyone. So where it says to, there's a drop-down box, and you can send it to the hosts and the panelists, or you can send it to everyone. So if you want everybody to read your message, make sure you select that first. Okay, so before we get started, some other things. The recording of this webinar will be available at this web address here. I think it's the same web address you go to in order to register for webinars. So everything's in one place, upcoming webinars and current ones. On your screen view, you should be able to see these PowerPoint slides and myself and Tom. Your video and microphone are muted, but in terms of your buttons and actions, you can communicate with us through the chat box and also through the Q&A box. So if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A box and we will try to answer them as we go through the webinar. And if you want to make comments or share some experiences, then please put them in the chat box. So to double check, everybody can hear me. Could you put in the chat box what the weather is like today? Because here, unusually on the south coast of England, it's a beautiful, beautiful sunny day. What about where you are? Lots of sunny weather. These are coming through fast. Mostly sunny. Windy and rainy. Oh, windy. I think windy's worse than rainy. For me, that's the worst kind of weather. All right. Okay, great. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and you should be able to see Tom and myself. And I would like to introduce Tom, and then he can begin. So today's webinar is called Autonomous CPD in Difficult Times. Tom has been teaching, managing and teacher training all over the world in the UK, China, New Zealand, Malta and Hong Kong. I don't know if there's anywhere else, Tom. He also works for Trinity and has done for a number of years designing, developing, delivering and managing the CERT TESOL and the DIP TESOL, and he's also a moderator for the CERT TESOL and for the relatively new Trinity CERT PT. He consults for Trinity on teacher education and assessment literacy, and he is the founder of Language Point Teacher Education, which is an organization that focuses on teacher training, and it works with people of all nationalities in all kinds of different settings. So it's about what works for the teachers in the setting they're in and helping them to develop teaching practices that are relevant and sustainable. So I'm delighted to welcome Tom to today's Transformative Teachers. He's been on this series before in previous years, so you may recognize him. So Tom, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks. It's great to be here. Really good to be talking to teachers again. I feel like we've been kind of restricted the last couple of years, so it's great to get out and talk to people again. So yeah, today we're going to talk about autonomous CPD, which we just have to define a little bit about CPD, meaning continuous professional development. So meaning what we do as teachers to get better with what we do in the classroom, right? So I think the idea behind autonomous CPD, as the name suggests, is that we have two types of continuous professional development that we can do. We can differentiate formal CPD, so formal professional development, which we would get from courses or maybe interventions and projects led by different organizations or institutions, where you typically have trainers who come to you and help you to develop certain aspects of your teaching for the benefit of your students, right? So you've got like an expert who comes in and kind of trains you to do things better. So that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're going to talk about the other side of that, which is autonomous CPD. And autonomous obviously means people working independently. So autonomous CPD would be where the development activity, the development of your teaching is initiated, so comes from, and is followed through, continued by an individual or a group of individuals. So basically you guys, teachers, without the help of external experts or support or guidance from these big institutions or training providers or whatever. So this is teachers helping themselves to develop in the ways that they need to develop for their own students and for their own classrooms, right? Good definition? It's very long.
Necessary, I think, Tom. We need to
Okay.
start off with a good definition.
Good. So as we've seen, the last couple of years has been really hard, right? So the industry in general, teaching and learning has been very up and down during the pandemic. Obviously, schools have closed, teachers have stopped working, a lot of teachers have even lost their jobs. So the opportunities for kind of regular ongoing teaching and learning have really been restricted for the past 2 years. As we know, we're all fighting hard to get back into the classroom, I think. So
I just invite people to just, if they want to comment at this point in the chat box, to share their experience. Has that been the case in your institution?
Yeah, this is the thing, because it's been so unpredictable, right? And classrooms have opened and closed, and schools have opened and closed, and people have been traveling and not traveling. So yeah, a lot of the courses and the projects and things which would have gone on with trainers visiting classrooms and visiting institutions and people traveling around countries to meet teachers and help them do what they do, it just hasn't been possible, right? The travel restrictions have stopped all that. So at the same time, a lot of what we do has moved online, right? This, what we're doing right now, this has been our lives for the past couple of years in a lot of the world. So teachers who've jumped out of the classroom and suddenly had to use Zoom or Teams or other sort of online platforms to teach, they've needed CPD. Suddenly, like now, like teaching on Zoom next week, what are you going to do? So a lot of sort of on the hoof or a lot of spontaneous teacher development had to take place. And I think the opportunities there with formal CPD were not so accessible because everyone was running around trying to find a solution. So a lot of teachers took it on themselves to develop the skills and the kind of the style of learning, style of teaching rather, that fit the way they were doing it and the platform that they were using. So yeah, so now I think teachers are getting a bit more used to being flexible. Maybe they're finding new ways of doing things, which is interesting. And that is kind of based on autonomous development that's already happened because of the pandemic.
Do you think that there might have been a sudden peak in teacher development, autonomous teacher development, when the need was there, but now on the other side of that, do you find that morale or motivation is a problem for teachers?
I think when we think about teachers, improving what they do on their own, I think motivation is a key thing. We're all busy people, right? Teachers are incredibly busy people. If you're not teaching, you're planning, you're having tutorials, or you're meeting students, meeting parents, you don't have the time to think about it. So yeah, building time to get motivated to do something to improve what you do is really important. So we're going to think about what happens when maybe a school doesn't give you the support that you need, which is quite common, or if you simply don't have time, how are you going to fit that in? It's really important to keep thinking and keep reflecting on what you do, but how, realistically. So the idea, I think,
it's difficult, isn't it? The time, finding the time.
That's it. So I think we were talking before, Lucy, and one of your suggestions was thinking about the teaching year, right? Not thinking about the week or the day that you want to do this thing, but thinking broader and thinking about the whole teaching year, the terms or the semesters, and thinking broader, thinking, well, when can I build time into the longer period, right? And thinking about these cycles, we call them cycles. We're going to come back to this idea in a minute, but building in these cycles of development. So sort of a week or 2 weeks when you can, plan for it in a few months, not next week when you've already got a lot to do. So the first step, I think, is to think about maybe 2 or 3 times in the year when you can build in a week or 2 weeks to focus, not solely focus on your own development, but to maybe have a plan, to think about what you're doing a bit and reflect on what you're doing and take some action to make things better. Does that make
Oh,
sense?
so you're breaking it down so that it's not too overwhelming. You're not putting too
Yeah.
much pressure on yourself.
Mm.
And the aim of maybe 2 or 3 times a year sounds quite small.
Mm.
But do you think that's the realistic amount of time
For a
people
lot,
can put in?
for a lot of people, I think yes. I mean, imagine if I asked you to spend next week focusing on a development point that you wanted to do next week. Your week is probably already full, right? So think, you're starting teaching again in whatever time in the future, in a couple of months, a few months. You're going to have more, you're going to be more likely to plan for it and allocate your time appropriately further in advance, right? Further in the future. So yeah, I would think it takes some time to build up to it, but I think if you do it 2 or 3 times a year, that's enough. That's a good amount of thinking and a good amount of development to do, I would say.
So how might somebody choose what point they should focus on? Because as you say,
Mm.
usually somebody comes in and makes some suggestions, and that's what you then work on.
Mm. Well, I think my coming from language point, as we heard, like the work that I do is mainly focused on teachers working on their own development in the settings where they teach. So they have needs which are very, very different from anyone else's needs. Their learners, they know their learners better than any trainer can know them, better than I know them. So they're maybe in a better position to work on their development with their students because they're the experts. This is why I did this for experts earlier. We call them experts, but really they're not. You're the expert. The teacher is the expert about the setting and the classroom where you work. So maybe a good starting point is, at the end of the working day or at the end of a class, you've got a class list, or you've got some kind of record of work that you have to keep normally. Find a place on there to just note down some questions or some points which came up in the class that you think, did I really deal with that so well? Or why did that we did that listening activity, why did that not go as I thought it would go? Just write down that question. Yeah. Ask yourself a question. That's the first point to kind of start thinking about what you need to do or what would benefit your learners a bit more. And you've got places to do that, right? A record of work, an attendance sheet. You've got classroom kind of papers where you can, mine are full of scribbles and notes to myself all over. My managers hate me, but I generally scribble down on kind of the record of work or the attendance sheet, and then I've got it in one place.
So you're a scribbler.
Oh yeah, totally.
That's your way.
Yeah. It's covered in questions and words and like, did I do?
So I see something in the chat box here, which is that actually planning on organizing is actually particularly difficult at the moment because there's so much change. And maybe students, there's maybe problems with attendance and just not knowing what's going to happen. Maybe that's quite a tricky thing to ask you, but what could you do if you just can't plan a few months ahead? Like, how can you still make the most of this?
Okay, well, one of the other things that I do is I look at helping teachers to organize what we call development groups. So where you take a group of teachers, maybe who don't work in the same school, but maybe who work in a similar setting. So you might have primary teachers working in, I don't know, Algeria. Right, it doesn't matter where in Algeria they are, they're going to probably be following a similar, going to have similar students or similar type of curriculum. Take it out of the classroom maybe and go online. Make a group, maybe a LinkedIn group or a Facebook group or something, and get together and think about the questions from outside the classroom. And maybe the changes which happen in the classroom then don't affect what you're doing so much, right? Obviously, change is bad, change is challenging, and we have to deal with change. But if you take that development out of the classroom and work with other teachers who are in a similar position to you, you've got a kind of a team then of people working and helping each other out. We'll talk about that again in a minute as well. So maybe we'll have a look at that some more.
Yes, and I suppose that really, if it's autonomous CPD, you can do whatever it is that's useful to you, and that might be just maybe a number of smaller things. It might be even something that is next week that's a mini developmental point. So there's no right way of doing this, is there? You can just do whatever fits in with your own context.
Yeah, I mean, even the idea of saving 4 or 5 minutes at the end of a class to just get some feedback from the students about what they enjoyed or what they found useful. Just quickly asking them for some feedback on what you did in the class if your students are of an age and a level where they're appropriate to do that. That can tell you a lot about how they're processing what you're doing, right? And if you're getting something negative back, maybe that's an area to look at. Or if they're not sure or a bit shy to answer, then maybe that's an area to look at.
So this, sorry to interrupt again, but there's something that again that's come up in the chat box, which is that it's a great idea to keep notes, but there's not enough time between classes if you're teaching back to back. But maybe, as you say, maybe the last few minutes of the class, if you can, you could actually say, okay, now let's sit down and I'll do it with you now and make it part of the lesson.
At the end of the day as well, those teaching moments, those teaching challenges where you think, did that go well? They stick with you, till the end of the day. At least maybe the next day you're back running into the classroom doing something else. But at the end of the day, maybe take 5 minutes and just think, what could have been better today, looking across your classes.
And I think we also discussed all kinds of different ways that you could keep notes. For example, for me, the best way is to make voice messages to myself. So I I make voice recordings as I'm walking along or rushing between classes, and then I can listen back later. And I find that really helpful. So I think there's lots of different ways of doing this. It's maybe just seeing what works for your brain.
Yeah. Oh, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can put your phone on the table or a dictaphone on the table and record what's going on in the classroom as well, and listen back to it. If you're really ambitious, you can record the class and watch it back if your students don't mind, or again, if you don't need too many permissions and everything. There's lots of ways of doing it, which are quite small to implement, but they have a huge effect. Something as simple as putting your phone on record and putting it with a group of students, that can give you so much evidence of what's going on and what's not going on when the students are talking or when the students are working.
Do you have any more of these? These are great. So you could be a scribbler, you could be a voice recorder, you could record the class itself. Any other particular things that
journaling as well. If you have, get a notebook and day by day you could build up some points or some questions in a sort of teaching journal. Again, end of each day or end of each week, sit down for 5 minutes and just scribble away and think, well, this week had some challenges with reading in a couple of my classes actually. So wonder how we can get this reading done more effectively. They were really tough texts, so we have to do some other work with it or whatever.
Great. Great. So,
okay.
So what was your next? Is there anything else you could say about the difference? Any other sort of opportunities that have come about in the last few years then with this change with Zoom? Is there anything else that we haven't covered?
Okay, again, with a lot of things happening online, I think the opportunity to connect with other teachers in different places has grown. I think we're spending more time online, and I think with the absence of physical staff rooms and physical kind of school visits and things, people are connecting more online. So that maybe opens things up to build these teacher development groups or these communities of teachers online, which are really, really helpful. The more we talk about what we do, I think the more opportunities there are for development. There's also a couple of new qualifications which have come out. I'm not advertising Trinity products, but the Cert PT that you mentioned earlier, the certificate for practicing teachers, is a great teacher development qualification, which is kind of above the level of an initial Cert TESOL, but below the level of a DIP TESOL. So that kind of fills a gap there, and that's kind of getting you thinking more about what you do through materials design. That's useful. Yeah. So there's a few things happening. The Trinity Cert OT as well, if you're teaching online, that helps online educators to develop. So the things, the kind of the training environment, these are more formal qualifications, but the training environment is definitely getting more diverse, I think. So more opportunities are happening online.
So I think a lot of people in the chat have talked about doing blended learning or going wholly online. So I suppose that now this has happened, this is more the direction that the teaching world is going to continue in.
One way or another, whether it's actually teaching online or whether it's managing things online and content resource management. That seems to be a growing area in education.
So the other thing that I wanted to just ask you is that then what about if you're teaching on your own? What if you're not part of a school? You are a freelancer, you do online teaching or one-to-ones. Where could you go to get some more ideas and to join a community? It may be a little difficult to set something up yourself. Do Yeah, how do you go about
I
finding a
mean,
community to join?
you can, I mean, there's a lot of resources on, again, social media, on LinkedIn and Facebook. There's a lot of teacher groups on there. You can just search for online teachers group and you'll get 100 results in there, and you'll find probably some people who are doing a similar thing, or online freelance teachers. There'll be a group in there with a discussion, open the door and get in there and talk to people. That's the idea. It's a bit like seeing, if you see it a bit like a conference, you're going into a group of people, a group of teachers who are all talking about what they do, then it's a bit like a room in a conference, maybe, where it's a forum to share ideas.
Yeah, and
you
then it
open that door
doesn't
yourself,
matter if you're on your own. Right.
though.
So how can teachers make the most of the opportunities that they have?
All right, so I think this idea of development communities is a really, really good one. If a teacher is proactive, or a group of teachers is proactive in working with other people in a similar situation, one way of leading a development cycle is a thing which I put together. If I just share my screen. Okay, it's a sort of cycle of development which I called IDEARS. IDEARS, it's got an R in there, but no problem. It's not the accent. It just has to be for for what it stands for. So this development cycle is a way of getting teacher groups to kind of impart and share ideas more sustainably, so that the benefit of these ideas can kind of move on to different teacher groups and expand. Well, people are raising their hands. Going to check that everyone can see this.
I can see this. There are people raising their hands.
It's 3 people now.
It's visible. People are saying in the chat that they can see, so I presume cool. It's okay your end.
If anyone does have a question, maybe you could write it in the chat and we can deal with them at the end.
The Q&A. We've got a couple of things coming into the Q&A. Yeah.
People putting their hand down now. That's good. Okay. So this IDEARS cycle, we've got this idea of getting a bunch of teachers together, whether online or face-to-face. I used to do this face-to-face, but there's no reason why to teach online through what we're doing now, through Zoom or whatever. So we have one teacher kind of takes the lead and selects a material or a way of doing something, like a little stage plan or a resource that they've used or a task that they've used successfully. And they share this, they introduce it, they introduce the background and a bit of the theory, having done a bit of research into it, to the other teachers in the group, right? So they might have, I don't know, an interesting way of dealing with listening recording, which is different from your general, press play, comprehension questions, finish as normal. So one teacher comes in and they think about where they found this and what the theory is behind it, and they introduce it to the group. So then the teacher micro teaches or demonstrates the activity, physical plan. It could be an online resource. You could well demonstrating this to Zoom or Teams or whatever. So you micro teach the resource to the group. Then the teachers get together and they discuss. They think about evaluating the material in terms of the teaching that they do, right? Because that initial teacher taking the lead may be all for her, but then there might be 3 people group where it just didn't work very well, or wouldn't work very well. They wouldn't think it was for their learners. So they're thinking, well, would this work? Would this not work? Might be interesting to try this, or we could. Then in a group, the teachers can suggest adaptation. So they adapt the resource or the material or the task or whatever, and they think about how they can make it more effective for the teachers that they teach, for the students that they teach, right? Because it might not work, it might have worked for the initial teacher, but it might not particularly work well for the new students, for the person in the group. And then finally, the teachers reflect on what they've seen and that process of evaluating and adapting and suggesting, and they gather together a set of kind of criteria which they can use to adapt materials or to create materials based on their evaluation, based on how they were adapting the resource, right? So it gives the teachers kind of a tool to help them to develop better materials and to think in that way about materials for their students. And then finally, the teachers who initially were receiving the new kind of resource, can share this with other groups of teachers as the introduce stage, and they go back to here, and then you've got each teacher maybe takes it away and shares it with their staff room, or shares it with another group of teachers, and kind of this good practice, this reflective good practice kind of goes out among the teacher communities, and it kind of spreads, and it builds actually a really effective network, a really strong network of effective practice. That makes sense?
Mm.
And this is totally organized by, maybe this one person at the beginning. Gone on LinkedIn, found 5 other people. Let's get together for a meeting. On Zoom. Why not? I've got this thing I want to show you. It starts from there. Or it could be a staff room. The gathering people together for 20 minutes just to go, this really worked. Let's have a look at it, and sharing from there.
So whatever context you're in, you can use this cycle.
And even if you're not in the same context as the original presenter, that's the point. You're evaluating it for your context, you're adapting it, you're thinking about how it can work for you.
Yes, I think those are really, really interesting points, that those 3, the evaluate, the adapt and reflect, because as you say, the experience of CPT has generally been somebody coming in and saying, this is what I do. And then sometimes you think, oh gosh, what do I do with this? And should I be doing this? And should I be doing that? And actually, if you start from the point of what kind of teacher am I? What kind of students do I have? What's the context? It opens possibilities up, I think. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. You have to pick and choose. You have to take the best bits for your students, right? That's the idea of, finding these criteria which work for your students. My students like this way of doing reading. So you've always got, that's an important thing to bear in mind. Or my students have problems with this aspect of reading. So your way is fantastic, but it wouldn't work for my students. How do I support that? Make those changes.
I just want to acknowledge, I know that there are a few issues with maybe internet and sound. I'm afraid this is the issue with using internet. Sometimes the sound comes and goes, but I think your slides were very clear there, Tom, and these recordings will be available. But I think sometimes there's a little bit of a disturbance on the line, but there's nothing we can do. I'm afraid about that.
That is at my end, actually. Yeah.
Well,
I don't know what's happening there.
It's yeah, we rely on the internet, and then when something goes wrong, we say, oh my God, what do we do? But right. So I think, as I said, this is when you talk about this, it feels very obvious. Like, of course, this is how we should be doing this, but it is quite different from my experience of CPD. And do you have any success stories that you can share with us?
I mean, yeah, we've got teachers who've, literally taken a piece of material that they've used, and it's gone. I did a meeting in Brighton in the UK with some teachers there from various language schools, and they brought what was a long time ago. They brought several things. A couple of them were really focused on reading and vocabulary, and I remember 2 of them were just so into discussing kind of ways that they could teach it, that it became, there were these ideas just bubbling up and kind of popping all over the place. And by the end of it, they took away, like an A4 sheet of questions each. The session had finished, and they were still talking about these, so they had all of this beautiful kind of the stimulus for professional development, and it was all done on their own. I was standing there, I showed them this ideas thing, and kind of they went off and did it, and I didn't really have to do anything. So, they came up with all this stuff themselves, and yeah, they went away and obviously had a lot of questions to ask about what they were doing, and that's the good thing. That's what we want, to reflect.
So do you think you just need maybe to take that step to start? Because when we first discussed this topic, I was just aware in myself, I had this feeling of slight panic and pressure, like, oh God, there's so many things to do, and now I need to train myself. But actually, when I think about times that I have chosen something and started reflecting on it and trying different things and getting feedback from my students, I found that very quickly I find it incredibly motivating and quite good fun. Do you think?
It actually takes less time as well than you'd think, because compared to making a time for like 1 hour or 2 hours or whatever for a formal session in the middle of the day when no one's got time. It's usually at lunchtime or in the evening or something, when you don't really want to be still working, then it takes a lot less time actually. And because it's related to yourself, it's kind of personalized, then you're going to be more engaged in it, you're going to be more motivated by it, because it's not an external voice coming in and telling you what to do, which is what sort of traditional training can often feel like.
Yes, I didn't really realize how the effect that had until realizing there's another way of doing things. But you also have some ideas on how teachers can then assess their own development, because that's a very important part of all of this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about development or learning in any situation, we always think about frameworks, right? Framework of assessment or a framework for learning. And it's really important that what you do is somewhat framed. It's not just a random, oh, that's a good idea, I'll try that. I mean, that's fantastic, but it's great that you try new things, but that's not going to necessarily make what you do any better unless you think about it, or unless you have kind of steps to evaluate what you're doing. So I would suggest, that maybe if you're thinking about doing this, I would start by stepping back a little bit and setting some goals for yourself. So setting development goals based on what your students need, what they need from you, what they need to know, what they need to be able to do, what they're tested on at the end of the year or whatever, and any language issues that they might have, what are the common language issues in the class. And by thinking about these as sort of criteria for development, then you'll make yourself sort of a checklist of 5 or 6 different areas that you can focus on. And you can think, well, I don't know, my students have a lot of problems with pronunciation. They have real problems with differentiating these 2 sounds. That's a point, right? So you can research that. As soon as you write that down and you think, well, that's a thing, that's something I want to focus on, you can do some research and you can think about good ways of teaching these 2 sounds or differentiating these 2 sounds. So then I guess the next step is to ask, how do I do this? And is there a better way of doing this? What do I really need to do this thing that I do every time I teach with pronunciation? How can I do that better? Or, has someone else found a better way of doing this? Pronunciation, we think about drilling, right? So how do you drill? Is there one way of drilling? Well, no, there's maybe 5 or 10 different ways of drilling new words for students, or drilling sounds. And which one works best? Well, that depends. They're all good if your learners get something from it. So doing a bit of research, finding out different ways of doing those things, and then trying them out when you've done the research and when you know why you're doing it, rather than just saying, oh, I found this thing, I'm going to do it. Much better to know why and how it's framed. That makes sense, on the students' needs, what you want to do, what you're trying to change. And then I guess the important thing at the end is to get evidence of the outcomes to find out whether what you're doing is successful or not. So this could be through tests or tasks, or just listening out for how your students are applying that area of language in their speech or their writing, whatever. But getting them doing it and thinking, well, did that actually work? Are they actually doing it? Are they giving me what I'm teaching them? If so, then good, that's a success. If not, then you need to start again, go back to the drawing board.
And do you think that it's important to, if your students are maybe old enough or capable, to ask for some feedback? I think that you can probably do it even with very low level, can't you? You can give them maybe smiley faces and less smiley faces to say how much they found it useful. How important do you think it is to get direct feedback from your students?
Oh yeah, I think it's ultimately important. Obviously, depends how much you trust what your students say when they're speaking to you as a teacher, as like an authority figure. They're probably going to be like, yeah, it was really good. But it depends on the class, right? Some classes are much more sort of honest and brutal with teachers when you ask for feedback. One way of doing it that I found, can't remember where I got this from. There's an idea called head, heart, bag, bin. So where you give students you do 4 pictures on the board, one of a head, one of a heart, one of a bag, and one of a bin, a dustbin, a rubbish bin. And you ask students to think back to the lesson and think, from that lesson, what would you really remember and take away? What really kind of affected you in your head and your brain? And that's the head section. So this thing I can put into the head part. anything that really they studied today and it really spoke to them, it gave them an emotional reaction. So maybe it made them laugh, or it made them feel, I don't know, feel sad or something. I don't know, hopefully not in your class, but that would go in the heart section, right? Something with an emotional reaction or a personal reaction. Then there's maybe something from the lesson, which was, it was okay, but it's not useful for me now. I'm not going to use that now, but maybe in the future I'll come back to it and I'll think about it. So that goes in my bag, right? That's the bag part. And then there's other things in the lesson, naturally, as with all lessons, that, fine, I learned it, but it's not useful for me. It's, I never talk about this subject, or I can already do this and it's fine. So that goes in the bin, right? So head, heart, bag, bin. And by splitting the content of the lesson into those 4 sections, you can understand quite a lot about how the students engage with what they're learning and how they feel about what they're doing in the lesson. Head, heart, bag, bin, I recommend it.
Really, really nice. I think that whether students enjoy the lesson is, of course, an important part of it. They're more likely to remember things or use what they've learned, or have more confidence in doing it if they enjoy it. So that's an important element. Yes. Yes. And I mean, I have found that it's useful to ask my students for feedback by giving them a piece of paper, and it can be anonymous. They don't need to write their name. They could just, and I give them a few things. I haven't done the head, heart, bag, bin, but I certainly will in the future. But I find it useful if they feel it's autonomous. But I have been quite surprised, disappointed to find that things that I've thought, oh, that went really, really well, it wasn't really what they wanted. And then the reverse happens, something where I think, oh, I'm not sure they really enjoyed it that much, but it turns out they were just really focused and paying attention, and they loved it. So I've been surprised how much the feedback can be different from my own perception.
Yeah. And students don't always smile when they're enjoying themselves, because if they're enjoying being engaged and really thinking about something, it might be a topic that doesn't naturally make you laugh or make you smile, but they can still be in there and really thinking about it. So I think, maybe that's the difference between having fun and like being really engaged in something and enjoying that feeling of being inside something, and really thinking about it. But the teacher's expectation doesn't always match with what the students come back to you with, and with different groups, you can have fun with one group with the same exact thing, the next group will fall flat. So
yes, and maybe it's slightly different. Maybe I think you just need to get creative if you're teaching young learners, or if you're teaching low-level students. As I said, you can do a sort of smiley face system or something like that to get some kind of feedback. The other point that we discussed, I think it's your last main point, but I thought was really interesting, is how teachers can then formalize their own development. So this isn't just something they've done by themselves, but it actually has a greater meaning in their professional development.
Yeah, because when we think of CPD, or when I deliver CPD courses or sessions or whatever, the first question the teachers usually ask me is, is there a certificate? I need a certificate. It's got to have my name on it. It's got to have a number of hours attended. You've got to have that. It's got to be a formal thing that you can show your employer or put towards your CPD allocation for the year. So that's kind of formal. But then in autonomous CPD, you can't write yourself a certificate, right? You can't give yourself a certificate. But what you can do is, if you set up one of these systems, one of these development groups, or WhatsApp group that helps teachers to connect, then formalize it for yourself. I think if you're the one who founded the group or had that idea, call yourself the founder, right? Why not? You're the founder of this teacher development group. Give it a name. That's nice. It appears on LinkedIn or on WhatsApp. The group's got a name. So that's, then you kind of got ownership of that. And you're the founder of this thing. It's very empowering to do that. If you're the organizer and you've got members in your group, that's the start of a more formal kind of community of educators, and something you can put on your CV as well. You put your jobs on there, and then you can put your education on there, but you're also founder of whatever teacher development group you had there. So you can formalize it for yourself. I think it doesn't have to be autonomous, just one person sitting in a room thinking about it on their own. It's, it can develop into a much bigger kind of, maybe a more formal way of presenting it, or a formal way of organizing yourselves, maybe. Again, it takes one person to do this. All about the motivation and then being proactive to do that, though.
So I think even if you're not the organizer or you're doing something by yourself, you could still put on your CV that you selected 3 points. You select 3 points per year to develop and work on and create resources. Because then if you're changing the way you do things and you're creating any resources for that, then resources creation is a skill. A big skill when we discover, when we really try to create something for ourselves that actually works, we think, God, there was quite a lot that went into that.
It is, and we all do it. You know, that's the one thing that everybody does at some point, is adapt or design resources for their students. Because let's face it, a lot of the books we get given, they're not perfect. And we do have to change things up, and, you know, it doesn't work for every class. So yeah, materials design is a huge thing that everybody does. So yeah, it's a skill. Put it on your CV if that's what you do.
And maybe because, as you said, the way institutions are working has changed quite a lot, especially with the pandemic, then I suppose that means that we need to think about our achievements in a different kind of way. So we can't say I attended X number of seminars, for example. So we do then need to just think, well, I'm doing these other things in a different way, and they're just as valuable, and if not more valuable.
Exactly. Yeah, it's much more, it's washed down to a much more kind of widely disseminated practice. I think CPD, as teaching in general, has become much more diverse over the past 10 years, let alone the past 2. So yeah, things have trickled down, and they've become more diverse and less kind of formal. There's more different ways of doing things other than just the big Trinity or Cambridge kind of qualifications. There's lots of other ways of doing it.
What do you think's driven that change over the last 10 years then?
I think the diversity of the industry. I think with things like the demand for online education in China, that was huge, you know, and that completely changed the way that people did things. With different types of language travel, you know, the standard model of, you know, the big group of kids, you know, going 100 at a time over to a school in the UK and getting their holiday and their study together. That changed with summer schools and with different sorts of camps, and, you know, there's all sorts of different environments that emerged over the past 5 or 10 years. But I think now, post-pandemic, they're all changing again, right? Because that's only just coming back in. So people are still got to study, they're still got to learn. So, you know, there's companies online that are offering their own curricula and their own learning management systems. There's a load more platforms than there were 2 years ago out there. So things are being done very, very differently. So
we're living in a challenging but also a very exciting and dynamic time. There's a lot of possibilities.
Not all of it's great, but it's very diverse. We can say that, you know, and out of diversity comes original ideas and new ways of doing things which fit what we do.
Is there anything else that I feel like there may be a few bits and pieces that we haven't covered along the way? Is there anything else important that you wanted to share? We only have a few things in the Q&A, so we'll come to those in a moment.
I do have some slides to review kind of what we've been talking about. Please. That might be an idea.
Yes, please.
Where are we here? So yeah, some of the ideas we've been talking about, I think it's only 45 minutes so far, so it's coming thick and fast. Maybe a good idea to review a couple of ideas we talked about. So what did we say? We said important to be realistic about time management when you're doing CPD, especially autonomous CPD. So maybe 2 or 3 cycles or ideas per term. We talked about how to record the points that you're picking up from your classes that you want to focus on. So journaling or keeping records of work or notes on my big scribbles on my class sheets that everyone hates, and I don't care because it helps me out. Getting feedback from students. So we talked about the head, heart, bag, bin thing, but looking at smiley faces or other ways of getting ideas back about how the students feel about what you're doing, and you can use that as a stimulus for development. We talked about self-observation, so listening and watching yourself. Much as everyone hates doing that, it can really reveal important things, aspects of your teaching that you don't see otherwise from the front of the room. There's also these contextually informed CPD qualifications, which is formal CPD, such as Trinity CPD. And remember that you can get a lot of development through communities of practice. So looking on even a LinkedIn group or a WhatsApp group, or putting hands up around the staff room of who's got an hour to spare here and there, or the cycle we looked at, the IDEARS cycle, to share good practice. We can look at self-designing a framework for our own development. Someone mentioned a checklist, a development checklist. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Where we're listening out, we're looking out for points for development, keeping a note of that and writing a list, doing a bit of research and making those aspects better. And also looking at formalizing the groups, the teacher development groups that you're part of, by even just giving it a name, naming yourself as a founder or a leader, and having members in there makes it more formal and gives you a sense of kind of ownership of that, and more is likely to come out of it.
Great, thank you. So and remember everybody that you can watch this recording again and see all of this, these slides as part of that on the site that you go to in order to register for the webinars. So that's really, really helpful to have all of that down there, Tom. It makes it feel a little less daunting and more exciting. And really, I think it then means that we can do whatever it is that we find that is important for us. There's a few things that have come up that there's something in the chat here. Is there any essential CPD you could recommend outside of CELTA? And I'm guessing it's just what's essential for you.
Pretty much.
You would say?
Yeah. Often it depends on where you work and what kind of system you're working under. Some education authorities have like a quota of CPD that people have to fulfill, 10 hours a year, 20 hours a year or something to retain their certification or good standing in their job or something. Really up to you. I wouldn't say essential, but if you're looking at a kind of a pathway through your development, I think it's a good idea to look at the different aspects of the different levels of qualification excuse me, that you can get. So sort of Cert TESOL being level 5, Cert PT level 6, diploma in TESOL level 7, and from there that kind of level system shows you a pathway, which is very useful. Finding the best thing for you, really, though.
Yes, I think so, because it may be, hopefully, a lot of institutions still do have some formal CPD, so that you have new ideas coming in without needing to go and research. But if you're doing this alongside it, you've got the best of both worlds in a way, I think. There's a question here from, I think it was right at the beginning of the webinar, and maybe it's already answered itself, but someone's asking, is autonomous teaching suitable for all levels? I suppose it's not autonomous teaching, is it? It's autonomous teacher development, so it doesn't matter the level of your students.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, every level has its challenge. It doesn't matter if beginners or proficiency, high level, sort of adults and level people. They each have their challenge. So it's about the skills that you need and the skills and what the students need at those different levels. In my opinion, no level is easier or more difficult to teach. It depends on the content, depends on the students, and it depends what they need and what you're giving them.
Yes, I see. There's a question here, discussing or negotiating the areas for professional development with potential participants of your teacher group. What's your experience?
I think that's super important. Yeah, again, that's the difference between the sort of formal CPD, where the content of the content of the training is kind of flown in from outside and kind of assumed to be useful without any discussion. I think it's the more you can discuss the needs of the different teachers going to be, and that's the idea behind that framework. So yeah, definitely discuss, definitely suggest ideas and focus on things which are going to be useful for the majority of people.
So you could just see what most people want to do in that group and start with that, and Yes, yes. Or I suppose you could even get together with one other teacher, couldn't you? If there's two of you, and the majority of people want to do something else, but two of you are interested in a particular point, you could still do that. There's no right or wrong way.
It's autonomous. That's the point. Yeah, you're not abiding by any rules. You're just doing what you need to do at the time with the resources that you've got. That's the good thing about it.
Yes, the example that I've done where I did some autonomous teacher training was I realized that I was struggling to find good listening resources, and I wanted authentic listening and extended listening at all levels. So I tried all kinds of different things with my students, and I got feedback, and it took a little while to find out what worked. But the way that I now teach listening is so different from what I did before. And now I've developed this particular way of doing it. I always create my lessons in that way, but I didn't have a time frame to do this in. I just every so often when I was doing listening with maybe this group or that class or whatever level it was, I thought I'll just try something different today. So it was quite dispersed.
But as long as you know what your goal is, right? So you're trying different things, but in the context of that goal, you've got that sort of plan or thought process at first.
Yes.
And then the different things that you do come into that context, and yeah, that's important.
So yeah, and so that's something that you can do on your own. Let's see, are there options to collaborate on development groups through ESOL societies or exam boards and build partnerships from our specific organizations?
Oh, good question. I can't answer that. I'm not sure if I've never seen it, put it that way. I've seen lots of, like if you're talking about big organizations like sort of IATEFL or, TESOL, whatever, Argentina, sort of the sort of TESOL organizations in those countries. I've heard a lot of presentations and content about development groups, but I don't know if they participate in them directly. Suggest it.
It's going to be so varied across the world. Okay, final question, slightly tricky one, but I think a very good point. Is there a bit of a risk that if we are talking about formalizing autonomous CPD, that institutions just say to themselves, I don't need to invest in this, I can just hand the responsibility over to the teachers and not actually need to organize anything myself?
Of course there is, yeah. I wouldn't let that be a barrier to kind of to just autonomously improving what you're doing, though. I would, yeah, it's a good point though. Yeah, maybe keep it quiet.
Yes, that's it. Maybe just do it. Yes, just do it as an extra, but don't tell the management about it. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. I think we've covered everything there. So thank you very much indeed, Tom. That was very inspiring, and we've had lots of positive comments in the chat. There is, as there always is, some people asking about a certificate of attendance for this webinar, and I'm afraid we don't provide certificates of attendance for these webinars because we're not training so much in a particular thing. This is just an opportunity for the teaching community to come together, share ideas and experiences, so that we just hope that you feel that this has been a valuable use of an hour of your time. But thank you very much. It's been wonderful to see people from all around the world joining us, and so Tom, I think we'll just stay maybe for a few more minutes, but and then Luke will end this webinar for us. So thank you everybody very much for coming. Next month, we are going to be looking at academic writing skills. So that's the focus of our next month, how you can break down the academic writing process and help to prepare your students better for the realities of life beyond tests and the realities of perhaps studying at university and those sorts of challenges. Okay, so thank you.